Okay, so what I want to do in this mini lecture is talk a little bit about the kinds of things we might talk about in the course. And in particular, I'm going to talk about one of the things that Mankiw discusses as one of the key thoughts about economics, which is incentives. So in Mankiw's textbook, his fourth principle of microeconomics is that incentives matter, or people respond to incentives. And the basic thinking behind this is you can often solve problems by changing people's incentives. And it's important in encouraging people to work in the interests of their employer. It's important in encouraging people to act in society's best interests. And sometimes you can pass rules that force them to behave in certain ways, but other ways, times, you can get them to want to behave in that way by changing their incentives. And we're going to see this throughout the course when we talk about government policies. But I want to talk about a specific government policy, and that is deporting people who have committed crimes. So, and in particular, we're going to talk about taking convicts to Australia. And I got this example actually from a Principles of Microeconomics text by Cohen. So it's another very good textbook. So, in the past, it's very expensive to keep people in jail. You know, the kind of story you get is that it's more expensive to keep somebody in jail for a year than it is to keep them in higher education for a year. And so this is a very expensive thing to do. And in the past, people were more cost conscious than we are nowadays, and so they needed other ways of dealing with criminals. And one common way of dealing with criminals, or troublemakers in general, was to expel them from the city, to kick them out completely. So this was a very common punishment in ancient Athens. So you often hear about famous Athenians, philosophers who get kicked out of Athens for violating what they want to do in Athens. So rather than catching these troublemakers and criminals and throwing them into jail or to prison, you just have them leave the country or the city, in Athens' case. And so this will tend to be cheaper in the long run than jail, in that you don't have to support them, and they're no longer your problem. They're no longer in your government. And hopefully this gets rid of them for good, although you often find people managing to come back at some point. Okay, so this was a common way of dealing with criminals in the past, and this was true back in ancient times, but it was also true as recently as the 18th and 19th century. So in the 18th century, this is one of the way the British government dealt with this. Now, before the American Revolution, one place they used to ship criminals was to the American colonies. Now, after the Revolution was lost by Britain, which is sad for me, being British, and happy for you Americans. After all, you're better off with freedom than you are under King George the Third, I think. And so before the American Revolution, many went to the American colonies. Once Britain lost the American Revolution, they had to find somewhere else to send them, and the place they found was Australia. Now, getting people to Australia, it's very difficult. It's a very long way from Britain to Australia. So the first convict ships were sailing ships at this time. And if you know anything about geography, Britain and Australia are about as far apart as you can get on the globe. So this is a very long way. And it took these sailing ships close to 8 months to reach Australia from Britain. So this is a long trip. Now, sorry. Although Britain had a navy at this time, they wanted to use a navy for useful things like fighting the French. And so rather than using naval vessels to do this, they would hire privately owned ships to take people to Australia. Now, one thing about this is the death rate was very high, kind of equivalent to what was happening in slave ships when they were bringing enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, not just the United States, but also to South America and the Caribbean. A lot of them would die, and this was true for the prisoners. A lot of them died of scurvy and disease and starvation. And so somewhere around 1/3 of convicts would die on these long 8-month voyages. Now, it's obviously difficult to feed and clothe and look after people and keep them from getting sick in a time when medicine wasn't as advanced as it is today. Um, so this probably isn't very surprising. But economists like to view these things partly through the roles of incentives, and this is what Cohen does in his textbook. And so the basic argument is that if you believe in economists in what economists believe, which is people are basically rational, is it's not really in the captains, the owners of these ships' incentive to work really hard to keep the convicts alive. It's very expensive to give convicts food, fresh water, and medicine on an 8-month voyage. And if they pass away, then you can avoid these costs. So, um, and so in a way, although I'm certainly not suggesting that the captains were purely rational in this sense, but having the prisoners die during the trip isn't the worst thing that could happen to you for your profits, because then you save money. You don't need to feed them and have fresh water for them and give them medicine to keep them alive if they passed away. So if you had purely profit maximizing captains, they might not really want all the convicts to survive. Now, I will admit this is a cold-hearted view of weighing things, and this is more, the actual facts are probably more complex than this, but I think this is a useful starting point on what to do. And so, profit maximizing captains wouldn't necessarily want the convicts to live. Okay, so this is kind of where we're at. We have a high death rate, and we have incentives that may encourage captains not to do too much to keep them alive. Now, it's important to note that death was not the goal of deportation, and there's various pieces of information that make you think this was the government really wasn't intending to have these prisoners die on their way down there. The first thing to note is that the convicts had not been given a death penalty. Now, the death penalty, Britain doesn't have a death penalty anymore. It stopped sometime in the 1970s or 1960s. The end of the death penalty. Some Texas, the state that we're in, of course, does have a death penalty. But Britain did at the time. It doesn't anymore. But at the time, death penalties were very, very common. There were over 200 crimes with a death penalty. So a lot of people did get killed, and it wasn't just for major crimes like murder, for example, that would or treason that would get you the death penalty in these days. There were over 200 crimes with it. A second thing is most of these people were minor offenders. These aren't hardened criminals who are being shipped over to Australia. This is minor offenders. The most common crime was simple larceny, and the way to think about simple larceny is it's stealing things worth less than a shilling, and that's about $50 in today's money. So if you think about the people who are being shipped to Australia, these aren't hardened criminals, murderers and killers. These are mostly people who, for example, got caught shoplifting, stealing bread for their children, or something along those lines. And it's important to note that the penalty for stealing goods worth more than 1 shilling was hanging. So if you did steal something, the equivalent of stealing a car now, you'd get hung for it in these days. So they weren't averse to killing criminals, but they didn't necessarily want to kill every minor offender who's doing shoplifting or something along those lines. A third thing is, interestingly, that there were places closer to England that they could have sent the criminals to, but these were seen as too dangerous for the convicts' health. For example, Gambia in West Africa and Southwest Africa. The problem with these African colonies that Britain was setting up at this time is that they were very dangerous for people to go and live there for long periods, and partly this was, it was just dangerous. It was dangerous, but mostly this was disease, things like malaria and cholera and all these tropical diseases that people in Britain didn't have much immunity to at the time. And so rather than sending them to these colonies, they decided to send them to Australia, which was further away. And if they didn't care about them surviving, they just could have sent them to Gambia, for example, and most of them would have died in a year or two from tropical diseases at that point. Okay, so the government wants to improve conditions. Now, the first thing, of course, that you do is you pass laws requiring better food, water, and medical care. But Britain didn't have a great way of projecting power at this point, and once the ship left British coastal waters, there was no real way for them to monitor what was going on. So maybe they pass laws, and then these laws just get ignored once the ships get moving. Another thing they tried to do was to have clergymen appeal to the captain's sense of humanity, try to encourage them to save them. Say we don't want to kill these people. You really should try hard to keep them alive. It turned out these didn't resolve the problem. The death rate remained high. But they did manage to resolve the problem, and the problem was solved by improving incentives. So, seeing the high number of deaths, what the government chose to do was take a new approach. And in particular, what they had been doing was they had been paying captains for the number of convicts they took on board the ship. So the number of convicts that got on the ship. What they changed this to was they decided to only pay for the number of convicts that survived the trip. So if you got down to Australia and most of the convicts were dead, you got paid a lot less than if most of them were alive. And this obviously changes the incentives of profit maximizing captains. If they want to get paid anything, they need to keep the convicts alive. And this made them more willing to provide better food, water, and health care. And this appears to have worked. The survival rate had increased significantly after this change had happened. So before the law, the captains had no incentives to keep them alive. After the law, they had a strong incentive to keep the prisoners alive, and they managed to do it much more effectively after the method of payment changed. So this is just a nice little example of incentives, and I will be doing more of these recordings, and I'll be in class too, so I hope that you find this course interesting.